I want to think a couple of things here real quick about doubting Thomas, first of all. But before I do that, I want to tell a story. And I'm going to indulge myself because I've told this story before, but it speaks so much to this idea of dangerous ideas. So I hope you'll indulge me if you've heard this one. It's an old rabbinical story, and it involves the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic faith. 17th century Rabbi Baal Shem Tov founded the Hasidic faith, a mystical sort of tradition out of the Orthodox Judaism. And it's rife with stories. The whole tradition is just rife with stories as the way of thinking, as the modus operandi for teaching. So the Baal Shem Tov was said to be dying. And he had gathered in a small hut, and his disciples were lined around him because this was his last days. That everyone knew this time it was for sure, and everyone wanted to be with him on his last moments in case he imparted some final bit of wisdom. And because they were very careful on how they transferred wisdom and his teachings from one person to the next, they made sure that the smartest disciple, the most astute disciple, was closest to the rabbi, so that when that last teaching was imparted, they wouldn't get messed up, they wouldn't screw it up, and how they could pass it down the line the way it's supposed to. You've probably played that game Telephone. Do you remember that game where you pass something along, and you know it's very important to get it right? And so that was the way it was lined up. They were circled around the bed. They were out the door. They were down the hall and even out the door on the porch and down the street a little bit. When finally the rabbi opened his eyes, and then the smart, astute disciple, he leaned in and he said, "Yes, Rabbi, what can you tell us? Can you give us some final thing about our purpose, the meaning of life?" And the rabbi looked up. His eyes just barely opened and said, "Life is like a river." And then he closed his eyes. And they waited for something else, but that's all that came out. So the disciple held on to it for a moment and paused and then turned to the next person and said, the rabbi said, "Life is like a river." Well, being responsible disciples, they continued to transfer it, one disciple to the next disciple. And being responsible disciples as they are, and also humans as they are, it began to change a little bit. It transmuted, you might say, as it was going along. There's something about a river that has to do with life. And then as it got out the door, and by the time it got down to the end of the road, the guy said, "I don't know, it's life, it's a river, it's all a big mix-up." And the last disciple said, "What does he mean by that?" So, being good disciples, they passed the question back down the line. What does the rabbi mean? We don't get it. What does the rabbi mean? And finally it comes in the room, down the hall, around the bed to that first disciple, the astute one, and he leans in and he kind of punches the rabbi's chest, and miraculously he's still alive. "What do you want now?" And they said, "Rabbi, we don't understand. What do you mean life is like a river?" And he, in his last breath, he looks up and he says, "So maybe it's not." And he died. So maybe it's not. It's a dangerous idea, this idea that we have with doubting Thomas, I think. This idea of what is real faith. And unfortunately, I think it gets mistaken. It gets misconstrued. And it becomes sort of a literal translation when we see this. And we often take it away with this idea that Thomas is the doubter. And we've shared in here before, both Linda and myself, in some of our message, that in India, Thomas is referred to as Thomas the Bold. The idea that Thomas was the skeptic and that he was willing to ask the question that perhaps the others were not willing to ask. But here's the thing that occurred to me as we think about this and this idea of dangerous ideas, is the fact that it's nothing new in our whole narrative spectrum of what's been going on with Jesus' life and the disciples following him. Raising from the dead is nothing new. They heard the story. They were present with him when he raised Lazarus. My question is, what else is this saying? What else is this really trying to get across? And I often think that that's one of the things we have to do when we go outside the text to look back at the text. I'll discuss a little bit more about that in just a minute, but what I mean by that. But just think for a moment. There may be something else there entirely because we simply look at it in one way. Think of a dangerous idea. Can you think of a dangerous idea that's changed the way we see things? Well, first of all, I'm going to back up here a little bit. Dangerous, if you look at the root word, dangerous means power and arrogance, and controlling power and arrogance. It doesn't necessarily mean fear. It means power and controlling and arrogance. Idea, if you look at the Latin root for the idea, the actual root word was this idea that an idea is a thing in the mind of God. In other words, it's root, it's authentic, it's essential first self. And then if you take it a little further, cognate, it means to see. So it's this idea of seeing with new eyes. What stirs in our culture, in our society, in our human being, what has stirred in a way that has caused us to see with new eyes? Can you think of something? It's not rhetorical. You can answer. Anything? 9/11. 9/11. For good or for ill, it changed the way we look at things. Civil rights. Cancer changes the way that we've looked at things. Becoming a parent. So actually what you all are describing are experiences that change the way we look at things. Think of ideas. Evolution, string theory. Evolution, Darwinian natural selection changed the way we think of things. The Copernican revolution, right? Y'all remember what the Copernican revolution is about from your history and science studies, from your astronomy studies? We no longer, the sun no longer revolves around us. Is this a test? No, it's not a test. The sun no longer revolves around us. The fascinating thing about Nicolaus Copernicus, when he came up with this idea, it was largely based on the mathematics of the time as well as just observation. He didn't have tools to look out too far into the universe, so just with what he had and with his observation, he began to surmise that in fact the sun doesn't revolve around us, and Mars doesn't do this strange sort of kind of twisted little thing around us like they used to imagine. That in fact we revolve around the sun, as do all of the other planets, as does Mars. It was a radical idea. For one thing, it completely challenged not just the reality, but the basis of reality for that time period was Scripture. The church sort of held dominion over the West and Eastern civilizations. And so the idea that this completely contradicted certain texts. So Martin Luther, for example, this happened in the 1530s when Copernicus came up with the idea. It wasn't actually published until the 1600s, the week or two just before he died. And the reason was because he kept insisting to his friends. The ideas were out there. They were already circulating. There were already popes who were challenging him and arguing with him about this. But he didn't want it published because it was such a radical idea. He didn't want the scorn on himself or on his family. He wanted literally to be dead by the time it was published because it was such a dangerous idea. And it kicked off this whole revolution for the next 100 years that involved, eventually ended with Galileo. Now, Martin Luther in the middle of this was also challenging the church. And it's interesting to me if we look back at these two things happening simultaneously. Do you remember Martin Luther, Reformationist, right? Do you remember why he challenged the church, the Catholic Church at the time? Challenged papal authority? Indulgences. The idea that you could buy your way into eternity or into heaven or your forgiveness of your sins. The authority was given to the church to dictate reality. And he challenged that. And he had these 95 theses that basically challenged that one idea of indulgences, and it revolved around Luther's notion that God is about grace. And that there's nothing that we can do, that we are loved and we are accepted as we are. But here's the interesting thing. So the famous thing, of course, is he nailed these indulgences to the door at the All Saints Chapel in Wittenberg, Saxony. In 1530, he was talking to a friend about Copernicus. And listen to what he says. Now remember, Martin Luther changed the direction of the church's history. A dangerous idea. Now he's talking about Copernicus. So it goes now, whoever wants to be clever must agree with no one else's esteem. He must do something of his own, regardless of what others say. This is what that fellow does, who wishes to turn the whole of astronomy upside down. Even in these things that are thrown into disorder, I believe the Holy Scriptures, for Joshua commanded the sun to stand still and not the earth. This was in the battle of Gibeon, where the enemy was about to sneak out during the night. And so Joshua prayed to God for the sun to stand still in the sky so that they could have victory. So Martin Luther, using the very phrasing to describe himself as someone who challenged the esteem and ideas of everyone around him, then criticizes Copernicus for the same thing. Anybody here ever do that with somebody else? Do we ever fall prey to doing this? To getting outside our own sense of vision, our own sense of ideas? See, dangerous ideas are dangerous because they change a reality, but it's also dangerous because it can become too fixed, too myopic because of the enthusiasm around it. So that even now, you can listen to someone like, I listened to TED interview yesterday. I was listening to Neil deGrasse Tyson again, one of my favorite. I love listening to him. And he was talking in this interview, and he says, Copernican was genius, of course, that he even came up with this creative idea to fathom that that the universe was some other system than we've always seen it, because we're so easily, we so easily adapt to the realities around us and the way others think. We so easily adapt to the esteem, as Martin Luther said, of others. And here Copernicus challenges the whole thing. But then he said what happened is that it still looked like we were the center of the galaxy. The sun and the earth, basically, it's all the center of that's all it is, because that's as far as he could see. So then you have a guy named Shapley who comes along, and he has a telescope that he's able to use. And this was in the 1700s, and he begins to see that there's these concentrations around galaxies, around stars. And they think of this as gaseous substance. But then he realizes from the sort of three-dimensional experience of seeing this thing that these are not gaseous substance. In fact, they're galaxies beyond galaxies that they hadn't been able to see before. So now suddenly the universe becomes even bigger, and we feel like we're at one end of the universe. And then Edwin Hubble designs the Hubble telescope, and it's out there, and it begins to see that, in fact, all of these universes, all of these galaxies are surrounded by other universes, and it just gets bigger and bigger. And Einstein comes along with the theory of relativity, that no matter where we are, it will always have the illusion that we feel like we're at the center of things, because it's that expansive. No matter where we are, it's relative. We will always have the illusion of being at the center of things. And then this is what Tyson says that I think is fascinating, of course, that we've discovered in the recent past, that the universe is actually made up of this stuff called dark matter, right? So that in reality, all we know about ourselves and the universe is about 4%. And about 96% of everything around us still remains a total mystery. And he said, what would you do in your life? What job would you do? What work would you do? What project would you pursue with only 4% knowledge? Realizing that there's 96% of it that you have no clue. He said, we are a speck on a speck on a speck on a speck in the universe of things. Dangerous ideas are audacious. But the other side of the danger is to assume they're right, or that they're the only answer. They can definitely change the way in which we see things. But the idea that they are the final answer is perhaps a bit too arrogant. So I want to think with you a little bit about what we can do with dangerous ideas. The story that Lori read, some of you might remember that it was from James Thurber. James Thurber, who was a columnist in the early 1900s and wrote wonderful essays and commentaries. It was a story I used to perform as I traveled around. This idea that the moth decides to go against the esteem or the opinion of everyone else around him. That he sets his heart on something he sees. where do dangerous ideas come from? For the next several weeks, I want to explore this. I want to think about this with you, is when we're thinking about our faith and when we're thinking about our relationship to creation and our relationship to one another, where do dangerous ideas come from? Do they mostly come from 9/11s? Do they mostly come when we experience cancer? Do they mostly come when we have the sudden sense of, oh my gosh, I'm a parent now? Now what do I do? Is it crises that bring about dangerous ideas? I personally don't think so. I think crises bring about some of the best in us. I think dangerous ideas are sparked by curiosity, by something that gnaws at us, by something that just catches our attention long enough that we ask a question. The problem with that sometimes is that I think we're afraid to pursue it, because that's a dangerous idea. If we pursue it, it could change everything, right? It could change the way we see things. So sometimes we'd prefer just to let enough alone. Let it be as it is, like the moth. Don't go heading out for stars. Stick around the bridge lamps. That's what everybody else does. Molly, my granddaughter, was over at our house a couple of weeks ago, and we have a sunroom that was turned into an enclosed den, and it has a window that looks out on the backyard, and there's a little bit of a raised garden there up against the window. And one day we were there, we were in the living room next to that room, and we heard this banging against the window. I said, what's that sound? It's just banging against the window. So I went and I looked around, and we both walked around there, and she heard the sound too and was like, what is that? I don't know. What is that sound? I don't know. And there were little marks on the window. And then suddenly, boom, this robin slams up against the window and then flies away. And it startled her. And then the robin slams up against the window again and kind of jumps back, and it's like it's shaking itself, and then it slams into the window again. And then I step up into the window, and I'm looking at the thing, and then it flies away like, oh my God, what is that? And I looked at Molly, I said, why is the robin doing that? And she's like, I don't know. Why does it do that? Because it sees itself and thinks it's something else. Because it sees itself and thinks it's the enemy. And as long as it sees itself there, it doesn't know anything else but to try to defend. And so it flies against it in spite of the reality. Abraham Maslow, who was the one who devised the human hierarchy of needs that many of us studied in college when we studied psychology, it starts with physiological needs, and then it has the social needs, and then it moves on up to I forget now what they are, but I know the top one's self-actualization. And Abraham Maslow had this very simple process. You could probably say what they are. Do you know them by heart, Todd?
They would start off with the basics: air, water, food, belongingness.
Belonging.
Kind of needs, love.
Yes. Yes, thank you. So belonging was in there in the middle, and then love, and then self-actualization. Here's the thing that I want to get across to you before we finish up here. Abraham Maslow had this hierarchy and said that's the way it is, right? It was a dangerous idea. He had completely structured this reality that this is how people orient themselves. This is how they individuate, how they become sort of whole and authentic, is this whole process. And then he began discovering things that in spite of this hierarchy, people continued to sort of operate out of these false notions, out of these learned behaviors. And he came up with this idea, and he said, if all you have is a hammer, then everything you see is going to look like a nail. Until you can change what you have, you can't see differently. And he said, there's another need in here that humans have that we don't cultivate enough. And that need is curiosity. That somewhere throughout all of that, curiosity has to burn, has have a spark in it, or else we never do get out of those same cycles. It's so hard to stop slamming in to the window. It's hard to break away from the lights like everybody else and look at stars and imagine there's actually something there. To break away from the reality in which we see the world not as surrounding the sun, but as the center of everything. It's challenging to do that. We have to find a way to have curiosity. So I want to end. We're going to spend the next several weeks just thinking about these dangerous ideas and what it means to do theology. I want to think two more things very quickly here. And the first is, I'm not sure why you come to 1111. I've talked to some of you. I've seen some of you write down some of the things. I know some of the stories. I'm not sure what brings you to a place like this. But this is a nice and strange environment. We do things differently in here, and yet it feels very right. There's something that brings each of us here. There's a curiosity, perhaps, that brings us here. At least I hope there is. Because the other side of that is that I think it's an idea that is needed in the world, what we have here. What brought me to the Methodist Church, for example, was John Wesley. Because I was active in the InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, and I was an evangelical, and I was very active in the Bible church. And what brought me here was this idea that there had to be something else than the way in which people were interpreting Scripture. And I came across John Wesley through my wife, who was Methodist. Wesley had the quadrilateral, this idea that there are four aspects that influence how we relate to faith. One being Scripture, but then there's also tradition. The church's tradition, the culture's tradition. There's also experience, our own experiences. And then, as important, is this idea of our ability to reason. To me, all of those things in constant dynamic dialogue open up the possibilities of where we are and allow us to move forward. Too much theology is done from the perspective of answers. You come to church, you get answers. You come to church, you get concretes. Too much people do theology with answers. On Facebook, you see it. It's all about the answers. Sometimes I think it's okay if theology is about nothing but questions. And I think what the quadrilateral allows me to do is to constantly sort of question things. To constantly be, as the Indians called doubting Thomas, Thomas the Bold. To be more skeptical. It's a dangerous idea to think perhaps we don't know, and that that's okay. Mary Oliver, I'll end with this poem that she has because I think it says what I'm trying to say too. The God of dirt came up to me many times and said, so many wise and delectable things I lay on the grass listening to his dog voice, crow voice, frog voice. Now, he said, and now, and never once mentioned forever, which has nevertheless also been like a sharp iron hoof at the center of my mind. One or two things are all you need to travel over the blue pond, over the deep roughage of the trees and through the stiff flowers of lightning. Some deep memory of pleasure, some cutting knowledge of pain, but to lift the hoof, for that, you need an idea.